Hello, friends. Today we embark on a journey through the sands of time to immerse ourselves in the everyday routines, joys, and challenges of daily life in medieval Egypt. Forget the pharaohs and pyramids. This is a different era, a different reality. This is a world pulsating with life, where the rhythm is dictated by the majestic Nile River, and prayers reach the heavens 5 times a day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, the first rays of the sun barely touch the minarets of Cairo or the towns along the Nile. It's not quite full day, but no longer night. The air is cool, filled with the scents of freshly baked bread, smoke from fires, and damp earth. From the mosques echoes the call of the muezzin for the morning prayer, far. This isn't just a signal for the faithful. It's a kind of clock for the entire city, for every village. Rising with the first call to prayer, when it's still dark but the approach of dawn is already felt, is part of life. For Muslims, who constituted the overwhelming majority in medieval Egypt, the 5 daily prayers were not just a ritual but an integral part of the day's structure. Each call of the muezzin, resonating over the rooftops, served as a reminder of the passage of time, of the connection to God, and of the need to fulfill one's duty. Women are already awake, some even earlier than the muezzin begins his song. In their homes, a fire is already burning, warming the clay oven where fresh bread, the foundation of every meal, will soon be baked. Kneading dough, lighting the oven, shaping the flatbreads, all this requires time and skill. Bread, typically made from wheat or barley flour, was so crucial that its consumption was measured not just in pieces but in dozens. No meal, whether it was a craftsman's hearty lunch or a poor man's modest breakfast, was complete without it. Alongside bread, cheese, olives, perhaps a few dates or fruits, if in season, often appeared on the table. For wealthier families, it might include cooked chickpeas, hummus, and sometimes even a piece of cured meat or fish. Men, having awakened, begin their day with ablution, wudu, preparing for the morning prayer. For many, this was not merely a hygienic procedure but a way to cleanse the body and soul before turning to the Almighty. After prayer, they begin to gather for work. Peasants head to the fields, nourished by the waters of the Nile, to toil under the scorching sun, cultivating land, growing grains, legumes, flax, and cotton. Their work was arduous, dependent on the whims of the river and the weather, but it was what sustained the entire society. Merchants and artisans living in cities prepared to open their stalls in the bustling bazaars, where trade would soon commence. Potters, weavers, leatherworkers, jewelers, each had their place in an economic system that functioned on the principles of craft and commerce. Children are still sleeping, wrapped in blankets, perhaps on mats on the floor, or on simple wooden beds. In large families, which were common, children often shared sleeping spaces. But soon, the bustle of the waking day will rouse them too. Older children will help with household chores, while younger ones will play in the streets that are gradually filling with the noise of voices, the clatter of hooves, and the creak of carts. Education for most was limited to memorizing the Quran in mosques or mosque-attached schools, maktabs, where boys recited sacred texts. Girls, as a rule, learned household management from their mothers. The Nile, like a vast blue ribbon flowing through the heart of the country, is already coming alive. It's not just a river, it's the artery of Egypt's life. Its annual floods were the guarantee of fertile soil, and its waters were the source of drinking water and irrigation. The first boats with fishermen and traders slowly move across its surface, carrying the hope for a new, successful day. Feluccas with sails resembling bird wings transport goods from one settlement to another: grain, livestock, ceramics, fabrics. Virtually everything was transported along the Nile. Fishermen are already casting their nets, hoping for a good catch to sell in the bazaar or consume at home. The water in the Nile was cool and clean, and many bathed in it, especially during the hot months, for cleansing and refreshment. In the city, streets that were relatively empty at night began to fill with life. Housewives with pitchers on their heads walked to public wells to draw water. Vendors, preparing for the day's trade, arranged their goods: fruits, vegetables, spices, fabrics, handicrafts. The air fills with conversations, laughter, the shouts of sellers, the sounds of hammers from workshops. Dogs and cats roaming the streets begin to forage for food, and crows take flight from rooftops, anticipating the day's commotion. Dawn in medieval Egypt is not just the change of light. It's the awakening of an entire world, a world living by its ancient rules, laws of faith, and rhythms of nature. It's a time when light slowly dispels the shadows of night, and every inhabitant, regardless of their social standing, prepares for a new day, full of labor, expectations, and unchanging hope for the mercy of Allah. This world, though distant from us in time, pulsates with life, and we have just glimpsed its first moments. Ready to dive deeper? Then let's continue. And today, we will delve into aspects that, to us modern people, might seem so mundane, but which then held profound significance: clothing, appearance, and hygiene. This wasn't just about what people wore or how they took care of themselves. It was a reflection of their social status, their faith, climatic conditions, and aesthetic preferences. So, before we pull back these curtains of time, don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment about what you remembered most from the previous part. This helps me understand what interests you and encourages me to continue creating similar content. Now, as always, get comfortable, perhaps light some musk or sandalwood incense to better feel the atmosphere, and let's immerse ourselves in this world together. Imagine a bustling medieval Egyptian market. What's the first thing that strikes you? Without a doubt, it's their clothing. The staple of both men's and women's wardrobes, regardless of social standing, was the galabia, a long, loose shirt or tunic that reached the ankles. This garment was incredibly practical for the hot Egyptian climate. Its loose cut ensured air circulation, protecting the body from the scorching sun and providing coolness. Most often, galabias were sewn from linen, a material that was accessible, lightweight, breathable, and relatively inexpensive. Linen fabric was ideal for the desert climate because it absorbed moisture well and dried quickly. Poorer people wore unbleached linen in natural shades, cream or grayish. Wealthier individuals could afford finer, bleached linen, and sometimes even cotton, imported from India or grown in Egypt. Men's clothing typically consisted of a galabia, over which, in cooler weather or for greater respectability, another, denser or more decorative tunic, possibly made of wool, might be worn. Headwear was obligatory. This could be a turban, imama, which ranged from a simple wrapped cloth for peasants to elaborate and complex constructions for city dwellers and clergy. The turban not only protected from the sun but also served as a status indicator. Some men also wore a kafia, or kafia, a checkered scarf secured with a rope, a gall, which also provided protection from sand and sun. Footwear was simple, leather sandals, or for the more affluent, soft leather boots. Women's clothing was also based on the galabia, but was often more refined and adorned. Over it, women wore a malaya, a wide wrap or outer garment that completely covered the body. Colors were diverse, but natural dyes were preferred. Wealthy women might have garments made of fine silk, embroidered with gold threads, adorned with precious stones or pearls. However, the most important aspect of women's clothing was the kamar, a head covering that covered the hair, sometimes even the face, niqab. Although the niqab was not mandatory for all women, it was common in cities, especially among the wealthier classes, reflecting more conservative Islamic traditions. This covering served not only as a religious injunction but also as protection from the sun, dust, and an indicator of modesty and self-respect. Footwear was similar to men's, but women often wore soft leather slippers adorned with embroidery. Children wore simplified versions of adult clothing, small galabias, often without head coverings for the youngest. Their clothes were mostly made of coarse linen, which was easy to wash and durable. Appearance and beauty were important, though understood differently than today. Cleanliness was considered an integral part of piety in Islam. Regular ablutions were mandatory before every prayer. Hammams, public baths, were popular places where people not only washed but also socialized. They were a kind of social hub. In hammams, natural soaps made from olive oil or fats were used, often with added aromatic herbs. Skincare included the use of various oils, such as sesame or almond, to moisturize and protect against dryness. Women, in particular, took meticulous care of their appearance. Henna was used not only to dye hair reddish brown but also to adorn hands and feet with intricate patterns. This was part of festive and everyday beauty rituals. Kohl, or surma, a black powder for eye lining, was extremely popular among both women and men, especially for protecting eyes from bright sun and flies. It was believed to not only highlight the eyes but also to have medicinal properties, protecting against infections. Hair was carefully combed and oiled for shine. Women also used various aromatic oils and perfumes made from flowers, rose, jasmine, and spices. Oral hygiene was not forgotten either. Miswak or arak, twigs from certain trees with antiseptic properties, served as a natural toothbrush. Egyptians inherited this from ancient times. An important aspect of hygiene was also shaving. Men often shaved their heads, especially in cities, while beards remained a symbol of masculinity and piety. Beard care was also an important ritual, including combing and oiling. In cities, there were barbers who not only shaved and cut hair but also often performed minor medical procedures, such as bloodletting or tooth extraction. Despite its simplicity, every element of clothing and care had its meaning. The quality of fabrics, the complexity of embroidery, the presence of ornaments, all spoke of a person's social status. For example, wealthy merchants might wear expensive silk robes embroidered with gold, while peasants made do with simple linen tunics. However, even among the poorest, clothes were kept as clean as possible, emphasizing the importance of cleanliness, both moral and physical. Overall, in medieval Egypt, clothing and appearance were not only protection from the environment, but also a person's calling card, their place in society, and their adherence to religious precepts. They were an element of cultural identity, passed down from generation to generation. Every day in medieval Egypt, as in any society, was inextricably linked to food. Nutrition was not just a physiological need but also a reflection of social status, religious precepts, climatic conditions, and local agricultural capabilities. In a world where refrigerators and preserves were unknown, the daily provision of food required constant effort, planning, and knowledge of traditional storage methods. The basis of the diet for the vast majority of Egyptians was bread. It was a fundamental product consumed daily, with every meal. Bread was baked from wheat or barley flour, often coarsely ground, and usually in the form of flatbreads, similar to modern pita or lavash. They were baked in home clay ovens, tabuns, which were an integral part of the courtyard or dwelling, or in public bakeries common in cities. The process of bread baking was a woman's task, requiring a significant part of the morning. The quality of bread and its freshness indicated affluence. The poorer ate simple, sometimes stale bread, while the wealthier could afford daily fresh, white wheat bread. The second most important food product was legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, hummus, and beans were cheap, hearty, and accessible sources of protein, especially crucial in a diet where meat was a luxury. Lentils were often cooked into thick soups or porridges, full medams, which could be served for breakfast or lunch. Full medams, slow cooked in a sealed pot, often overnight, was and remains a popular dish in Egypt. It was served with olive oil, onions, garlic, herbs, and sometimes eggs for those who could afford them. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal but readily available due to the fertility of the Nile. Onions, garlic, cucumbers, eggplants, cabbage, and various greens, coriander, parsley, were common. They were consumed fresh, pickled, or added to stews. Fruits such as dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, melons, and watermelons, in season, were not only desserts but also important sources of vitamins and sugar. Dates, in particular, were extremely important, easy to store, nutritious, and inexpensive. They were part of the diet for both the poor and the rich. Syrups were made from dates, and they were used to sweeten dishes. Meat was a luxury for most of the population. It was typically eaten only on holidays or special occasions. This included lamb, goat, and less commonly beef. Pork was forbidden by Islamic law. Poultry, such as chicken, pigeons, or quails, was more accessible, especially in rural areas where each family might keep a small flock. Fish was an important source of protein for those living near the Nile or on the coast. It was caught, dried, salted, or consumed fresh. Salted fish was a common product that allowed for long-term storage. Dairy products included milk, cow, goat, sheep, cheese, often a soft variety, similar to feta, and yogurt. Butter and ghee, clarified butter, were used for cooking. Spices were an integral part of Egyptian cuisine, thanks to its proximity to trade routes and its own production of some. Cumin, coriander, black pepper, turmeric, cardamom, cinnamon, ginger, all added flavor and aroma to dishes. Spices were also used for preservation and as medicinal remedies. Beverages. Water was the most common drink, sourced from the Nile, wells, or sables, public fountains. It was often sweetened with date syrup or fruit juices, especially in hot weather. Alcohol was forbidden by Islam, although some non-Muslim communities, like the Copts, might consume wine or beer. Coffee only appeared in Egypt in the late medieval period, and tea even later. Meals. The day began with a light breakfast after the morning prayer, consisting of bread, full, and cheese. Lunch was the main meal, usually around noon or early in the workday. It might include vegetable stews with legumes, bread, and perhaps a little fish or poultry for the wealthy. Dinner was lighter, often consisting of leftovers from lunch or simple snacks. Meals were typically eaten sitting on the floor around a low table, using the right hand or pieces of bread instead of cutlery. Cooking and storage methods. Cooking took place over open fires or in clay ovens. Stewing, boiling, baking, and frying were the main methods. For preserving food, drying, fruits, vegetables, fish, salting, fish, cheese, and pickling were used. Grain was stored in special granaries or underground cellars, protected from moisture and pests. Meat could be dried or salted. Clay pots and utensils were everyday items for preparing and storing food. Diet by social status. Although the basic diet was similar for all, the differences in nutrition between various social classes were significant. Poorer peasants and laborers lived on the brink of survival, and their diet was almost entirely vegetarian, based on grains and legumes. They were highly dependent on the Nile's harvest. A poor flood could lead to famine. Wealthier city dwellers, merchants, ulama, and rulers had access to a greater variety of foods, meats, more expensive spices, imported fruits, sweets made from honey and nuts. Their feasts were more generous, with more dishes and beverages. At the courts of rulers, exotic fruits, desserts, and refined meat dishes prepared by the best chefs were served. The culinary traditions of medieval Egypt were not just a matter of survival but also part of its cultural identity. Many dishes that were popular 1,000 years ago are still staples in modern Egypt, testifying to the living legacy of this rich cuisine. This demonstrates a deep connection between the past and present, where the tastes and aromas of centuries ago continue to live on the tables of modern Egyptians. Food united people, served as a reason for celebrations, an expression of hospitality, and a way to maintain family and community ties. In a world that was simpler yet more complex, food remained a central element of daily existence. Life in a country where most of the territory is a vast, sun-baked desert. In such an environment, water becomes not just a resource, but the absolute essence of existence, the boundary between life and death. For medieval Egypt, as for its predecessors, this essence was and remains the Nile. This majestic river, flowing from south to north, was the backbone of civilization, its pulsating artery. Without the Nile, its annual floods, and its constant presence, Egypt would be nothing more than another barren desert. The annual floods of the Nile were an event of extreme importance, defining the entire agricultural calendar and, consequently, the life of every Egyptian. They began approximately in June, peaked in August-September, and receded by October. These floods brought not only water but also fertile black silt from the Ethiopian highlands, which settled on the fields after the water receded, enriching the soil and making it incredibly fertile. Egyptians developed complex irrigation systems with canals, dams, and sluices to utilize these floods as efficiently as possible. This engineering skill, inherited from their ancestors, was key to maintaining high agricultural productivity. Peasants constantly maintained the canals, clearing them of silt, and repairing dams, as their harvest and, in essence, their survival depended on it. However, the Nile, though a source of life, could also be a source of problems. If the flood was too weak, it led to drought, crop failure, and famine. If it was too strong, it could cause devastating floods that destroyed homes and fields. There was always anxiety and anticipation regarding the Nilometer, special structures for measuring the water level in the Nile, which provided an idea of the future harvest. The Nilometer results were announced publicly, and the mood of the entire populace depended on them. Besides irrigating the fields, the Nile's water was used for drinking. It was the primary, and often the only, available source of drinking water for most of the population. In cities and villages, there were special places for collecting water, either directly from the river or from wells fed by groundwater connected to the Nile. To supply city dwellers with water, aqueducts were built, such as the famous Saladin Aqueduct in Cairo, which delivered water from the Nile to the citadel. Storing drinking water was vital. Water was kept in large clay jars, cullis or zirs, which, thanks to the porous structure of the clay, allowed water to evaporate from the surface, cooling it. This was a natural refrigerator that provided cool water even on the hottest days. These jars were an everyday item in every home. Public fountains, known as sables, were also common in cities and provided free access to drinking water for all. Often, sables were built together with maktabs, schools, and were charitable institutions supported by wealthy citizens. Of course, with such a water source, which was both a source of life and a source of disease, serious sanitation problems arose. Medieval medicine did not fully understand the nature of microbes, so water used for drinking, bathing, and irrigation also carried various infections. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and other waterborne diseases were common and often fatal. Water pollution from human waste and animal waste was a serious problem, especially in densely populated urban areas. Despite regular ablutions, which were part of religious rituals, and existing hammams, baths, the overall level of hygiene and sanitation was significantly lower than in the modern world, leading to frequent epidemics. The Nile's water was also a key factor in transport and trade. The rivers served as the main transport artery, connecting Upper and Lower Egypt, and also opened the way to the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea via canals and overland routes. Boats, from small feluccas to large merchant vessels, constantly plied the Nile, transporting grain, livestock, building materials, pottery, textiles, spices, and other goods. This made transport cheaper and more efficient than overland caravan routes, although these were also important for connecting with other regions. The ports of Cairo, e.g., Fustat, were bustling centers where goods arrived from across the empire and neighboring countries. The use of water was not limited to drinking, irrigation, and transport. Water was also used for industrial purposes, for brick production, from Nile silt, for dyeing textiles, for operating mills. In cities, there were water wheels and other mechanisms that used the force of the Nile's current to perform various tasks. The entire way of life in medieval Egypt was permeated by an awareness of the importance of water. Its availability, its purity, its level in the Nile, all of this was a subject of daily concern, conversations, and prayers. Water was not just an element of nature, but also part of the social, economic, and religious fabric of society. It shaped the landscape, dictated the pace of life, affected health, and determined wealth. Ultimately, it was a society that lived daily with the awareness that its existence depended on a single river, flowing through their lands, bringing both life and its challenges. And this understanding was deeply ingrained in the consciousness of everyone, from the simple peasant to the most powerful sultan. At the heart of medieval Egyptian society, as in any other, was the family. It was a fundamental unit that ensured not only survival but also the transmission of values, traditions, and social norms. Home life in those times was closely intertwined with economic activity, religious duties, and social connections, creating a complex but robust system. Typical for medieval Egypt was the extended family. This meant that several generations lived under one roof or in close proximity: parents, their married children with their families, and possibly unmarried relatives. Such a structure provided mutual support, division of labor, and a kind of social safety net in a world where state social institutions were minimal. Older family members, especially grandparents, enjoyed great respect and often played a key role in raising children and transmitting knowledge. The roles of men and women in the home were clearly defined, though not as rigid as they might seem at first glance. The man was considered the head of the family, its provider and protector. His primary duty was to ensure the material well-being of the family, whether by working in the fields, engaging in crafts, trade, or state service. He was responsible for the family's external ties, representing its interests in the community, and relations with authorities. The woman, for the most part, was the guardian of the home, managing all internal affairs. Her duties included preparing food, raising children, housekeeping, baking bread, spinning thread, and sewing clothes. In rural areas, women also participated in agricultural work, helping men in the fields, especially during harvest. Urban women, especially from poor families, might engage in petty trade in the market, spinning, or custom sewing to supplement the family income. It is important to note that although women had limited opportunities for public life, they had significant influence within the home and family, as well as certain rights guaranteed by Islamic law, such as the right to property. Child-rearing was a shared responsibility, but the greatest burden lay with the mother and grandmothers. Children were taught practical skills from a young age that would be useful in their adult lives. Boys spent time with fathers and older men, learning a profession, craft, or agriculture. They were also sent to the maktab, a school attached to a mosque, to learn the Quran and basic literacy. Girls stayed at home, learning from their mothers and older women all the intricacies of housekeeping, needlework, cooking, and childcare. Marriages were often arranged by parents, especially in wealthy families, to strengthen social ties or economic standing. Early marriages were common, but this did not mean an absence of affection. Love and attachment often developed after the marriage. Housing in medieval Egypt varied greatly depending on social status and region. In rural areas, houses were simple, built from sun-dried clay, adobe bricks, or Nile mud. They had thick walls that provided coolness in summer and retained heat in winter. Roofs were often flat and used for sleeping on hot nights or for storing belongings. Houses had few windows, or they were small and placed high up to ensure privacy and protection from the sun. Inside, there was minimal furniture, mats on the floor, low tables, cushions. Families often slept together in one room. In cities, housing was denser and more varied. Houses were often multi-storied, built from fired brick or stone. A characteristic feature was their arrangement around an inner courtyard, saha, which provided privacy, coolness, light, and ventilation. This courtyard was the heart of the home, where the family gathered, children played, and household chores were performed. Windows facing the street were rare or had intricate wooden latticework, mashrabia, that allowed one to see what was happening outside while remaining unseen. Homes of wealthy city dwellers might have several floors, separate quarters for men and women, luxurious carpets, cushions, exquisite household items, and decorations. Urban homes also often had special niches for storing dishes and utensils. Daily life was simple but functional. Lighting was provided by oil lamps. Water for drinking and hygiene was stored in clay jugs. Clay pots and metal cauldrons were used for cooking, placed over a fire. Furniture was minimal but practical. Low wooden tables, mats made of reeds or palm leaves for sitting and sleeping, wool blankets. Dishes were predominantly ceramic, though the wealthy might have metal or even glass tableware. Family celebrations were an important part of life. Weddings were lavish affairs lasting several days, accompanied by music, dancing, and feasting. The birth of a child was also celebrated with great joy, especially the birth of a boy. The circumcision of boys was an important event, accompanied by celebrations. Funerals, on the other hand, were a time of mourning, but also of community support. Despite its outward simplicity, home life in medieval Egypt was filled with deep meaning, rituals, and strong bonds. It was a world where every family member had their role and responsibility, where support was mutual, and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. The family was the nucleus that helped withstand life's challenges, providing a sense of belonging and security in a changing world. In medieval Egypt, where the Word of God was the highest authority and the pursuit of wisdom was a sacred duty, education and knowledge occupied a special place. Unlike modern standardized systems, medieval education was diverse, deeply rooted in religious institutions, and often personalized. It served not only to transmit information but also to shape moral character and preserve the rich intellectual heritage. The fundamental level of education for most children began in the maktab, also known as kutab or kutub. These were elementary schools, usually attached to mosques or simply located in a teacher's home, or a dedicated small room in a neighborhood. Boys, and sometimes girls, though less commonly, and often at home or in separate small groups, started attending maktabs from a young age, typically around the age of 4 or 5. The primary goal was to teach them to recite and memorize the Holy Quran. This was done by rote learning, with children repeating verses after the teacher. They also learned basic literacy, reading and writing Arabic script, which was essential for understanding the Quran. In addition to religious texts, they acquired fundamental arithmetic skills needed for daily life and trade. Teachers in maktabs were usually local imams or respected members of the community, whose authority was unquestioned. Discipline was strict, sometimes involving physical punishment, but the goal was to instill respect for knowledge and faith. For those who desired a deeper understanding and had the means or patronage, education continued at the madrasas, madris. Madrasas were higher educational institutions that emerged as prominent centers of learning, particularly from the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods. They were often endowed by sultans, emirs, or wealthy patrons as charitable foundations, waqfs, providing stipends for students and teachers, as well as accommodation for those who came from afar. Madrasas offered a comprehensive curriculum that went far beyond mere religious studies. The core of madrasa education was Islamic sciences, including tafsir, Quranic exegesis, the interpretation and understanding of the meanings of the Quran; hadith studies, the study of the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, their authenticity and meaning; fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, the study of Islamic law, its principles and applications in daily life, justice, and governance; Arabic language and literature, mastering grammar, nahw, syntax, sarf, rhetoric, balagha, and poetry. This was crucial for understanding religious texts and for administrative communication. Beyond religious studies, madrasas often offered a broader range of rational sciences, ulum al-aqliya, or secular subjects, depending on the specialization and patronage. Mathematics, including algebra, which has Arabic roots, al-jabr, and geometry. Astronomy, essential for determining prayer times, the direction of the Kaaba, Qibla, and navigation. Observatories were sometimes attached to madrasas or major mosques. Medicine, as previously discussed, this was a highly developed field, often studied in conjunction with attached hospitals, bimarists. Philosophy and logic, though sometimes viewed with suspicion by more conservative religious scholars, these were crucial for intellectual development and theological debate. History and geography, for understanding the world and the context of Islamic civilization. Al-Azhar Mosque and University in Cairo stands out as the most prominent and enduring educational institution of medieval Egypt, and indeed, the entire Islamic world. Founded by the Fatimids in the 10th century, it initially served as a center for Ismaili, Shura, doctrine, but later became a leading Sunni learning institution under the Ayyubids and Mamluks. Al-Azhar attracted students and scholars from across the Muslim world, offering a vast array of subjects and maintaining a reputation for academic excellence that continues to this day. Its lecture halls were filled with students, some sitting directly at the feet of renowned scholars, sheikhs, engaging in lively discussions and debates. Learning methods were primarily based on lectures, memorization, and scholarly debates. Students would attend sessions with different sheikhs, taking notes and discussing complex topics. A key aspect was the ijaza, a license granted by a scholar to a student, certifying their proficiency in a particular subject and authorizing them to teach it to others. This system of personal teacher-student relationships ensured the transmission of knowledge and established a chain of authority. Libraries were vital for scholarly pursuits. Large mosques and madrasas often had extensive libraries containing thousands of manuscripts on various subjects. Private collections of wealthy scholars and patrons were also significant. Scribes were employed to copy texts, ensuring their preservation and dissemination. The act of acquiring and copying books was a sign of intellectual dedication and wealth. The role of scholars, ulama, was paramount. They were the intellectual elite, serving as teachers, judges, qadis, legal experts, muftis, and advisors to rulers. Their knowledge was highly respected, and they played a crucial role in shaping the moral and intellectual landscape of society. While formal education was mainly for boys and young men, girls from wealthier families often received education at home, learning the Quran, Arabic language, and poetry from private tutors or their mothers. Women scholars, though fewer in number, also existed and were respected for their knowledge, particularly in hadith studies. In essence, Education in medieval Egypt was not a separate sphere of life but was deeply interwoven with religious faith and societal norms. It was a rigorous system that valued memorization and understanding, fostered intellectual curiosity, and preserved a vast body of knowledge, making medieval Egypt a beacon of learning in the Islamic world. In medieval Egypt, the vibrant pulse of economic life manifested most vividly in its trade and bazaars, souks. These were not merely places for buying and selling goods. They were dynamic social hubs, melting pots of cultures, and crucial arteries for the flow of wealth and information throughout the vast Islamic world and beyond. From bustling urban markets to remote desert caravans, trade was the lifeblood that nourished the Egyptian economy. Cairo, as the capital and largest city, boasted the most extensive and diverse network of souks. The famous Khan al-Khalili, established in the 14th century, remains a living testament to this vibrant trading tradition, though its current form differs from its medieval appearance. Other major cities like Alexandria, a key maritime port, Fustat, the older part of Cairo, and Damietta also hosted significant markets. The structure of the souk was highly organized, often by specialization. Each trade or craft typically had its own dedicated section or alley. Spice merchants, aromatic sections overflowing with cinnamon, cardamom, cumin, saffron, and pepper, brought from India, Arabia, and East Africa. Textile merchants, alleys filled with various fabrics, fine Egyptian linen, imported silks from China, cotton from India, and wool. Goldsmiths and jewelers, often located in secure areas, displaying intricate silver and gold ornaments, and precious stones. Potters and glassblowers, selling everyday earthenware, beautifully glazed pottery, and delicate glass lamps or vessels. Perfumers, offering exquisite perfumes, aromatic oils, and incense. Food markets, separate sections for fruits, vegetables, bread, meat, and fish, often operating daily. Trading practices were characterized by lively bargaining. Haggling over prices was not just common but expected, a form of social interaction and a display of commercial acumen. Fixed prices were rare. Instead, buyers and sellers engaged in a ritualistic dance of negotiation. Payment was usually in various forms of currency, predominantly gold dinars and silver dirhams, but bartering of goods was also practiced, especially in rural areas. Merchants, tujar, occupied a respected position in society. They ranged from wealthy international traders who managed vast networks and financed large caravans, to small street vendors and shopkeepers who sold their wares daily. Large merchants often established trading houses and formed partnerships, pooling resources for major ventures. They financed caravans that traversed the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Silk Road, bringing exotic goods from distant lands. They also owned ships that sailed the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, connecting Egypt to the wider world. These merchants played a vital role not only in the economy but also as cultural intermediaries, bringing new ideas, technologies, and customs. Caravans were the backbone of overland trade. Long lines of camels, laden with goods, traversed vast distances, often accompanied by armed guards for protection against bandits. Caravanserai, khans or funduks, were indispensable for these journeys. These fortified inns provided safe lodging for merchants, their animals, and their goods. They offered stables, warehouses, living quarters, and often a mosque and a communal bathing area. These were bustling centers of exchange and rest for weary travelers and their animals. Maritime trade was equally important, particularly through the port of Alexandria. Ships from Byzantium, Italy, Venice, Genoa, Sicily, North Africa, and the Levant arrived, exchanging goods with Egyptian merchants. Spices, textiles, sugar, and papyrus, though its production declined over time, were major Egyptian exports, while luxury goods, timber, and certain raw materials were imported. The Red Sea ports, connecting to the Indian Ocean trade routes, brought even more exotic goods from India, China, and Southeast Asia. The government's role in trade was significant. Customs duties and taxes on goods were a major source of state revenue. The state often regulated market prices for essential goods to prevent speculation and ensure stability, especially during times of scarcity. Inspectors, mutasibs, were appointed to oversee market conduct, ensure fair weights and measures, prevent fraud, and enforce Islamic morality in commercial dealings. The souk was a sensory experience, a symphony of sounds, hawkers' cries, clanging hammers, chatter, a kaleidoscope of colors, rich fabrics, vibrant spices, fresh produce, and a medley of aromas, perfumes, incense, roasting meats, pungent spices. It was a place where people socialized, exchanged news, and gathered information. Coffee houses, which became popular in later medieval times, also served as meeting points for merchants and storytellers. In essence, trade and bazaars were the beating heart of medieval Egypt. They were not just economic engines but complex social organisms that reflected the dynamism, multiculturalism, and interconnectedness of one of the greatest civilizations of its time. The souks embodied the spirit of enterprise, the pursuit of knowledge, and the art of daily interaction, making them an indispensable window into the daily life of the era. Beyond the bustling bazaars and fertile fields, the economic heart of medieval Egypt also beat within its countless crafts and workshops. These were the places where raw materials were transformed into the goods that fueled trade, equipped armies, adorned homes, and dressed its people. The craftsmanship of Egyptian artisans was renowned throughout the Islamic world and beyond, testifying to their skill, dedication, and ingenuity. Urban centers, particularly Cairo, Fustat, and Alexandria, were hives of craft activity. Guilds played a crucial role in organizing these trades. A guild, or herfa/sinf, was an association of artisans working in the same craft. They regulated production, maintained quality standards, set prices, sometimes in cooperation with state officials, trained apprentices, and provided mutual support to their members. Joining a guild often required years of apprenticeship, progressing from a young trainee to a journeyman, and eventually to a master craftsman, ustad. These guilds not only ensured economic stability, but also fostered a sense of community and shared identity among their members. Key crafts that flourished in medieval Egypt included textile production. Egypt was famous for its high-quality linen. The fertile Nile Delta provided abundant flax, which was processed into fine linen fabrics. Cotton, introduced later, also became important. Artisans spun yarn, wove cloth on looms, and then dyed the textiles using natural pigments derived from plants and minerals. Elaborate patterns were often woven or embroidered, particularly on silk and fine linen. Egyptian textiles were highly sought after across the Mediterranean and in the Islamic East. Pottery and ceramics. Clay was readily available from the Nile. Potters created a vast array of vessels, from simple unglazed water jars, kulas, that kept water cool through evaporation, to beautifully glazed bowls, plates, and tiles. Different glazes and decorative techniques were employed, often featuring intricate geometric patterns, floral motifs, or calligraphy. Fustat, in particular, was a major center for pottery production, known for its distinctive lusterware and polychrome ceramics. Glassware: Egyptian glassmakers produced stunning pieces, including mosque lamps, bottles for perfumes, drinking vessels, and decorative items. Techniques involve blowing, molding, and often decorating with enamel or gold leaf. Egyptian glass was prized for its clarity and craftsmanship. Metalworking: coppersmiths, blacksmiths, and jewelers created a wide range of metal goods. Copper and bronze were fashioned into household items like cooking pots, trays, ewers, and decorative lamps. Iron was used for tools, weapons, and architectural elements. Jewelers, often working with gold and silver, crafted exquisite rings, bracelets, necklaces, and other personal ornaments, frequently inlaid with precious or semi-precious stones. Their work often featured intricate filigree and granulation. Woodworking: despite wood being a relatively scarce resource in Egypt, carpenters and carvers created beautiful furniture, doors, intricate screens, mashrabiyas, and mosque pulpits, minbars. Wood was often carved with geometric patterns, arabesques, and calligraphic inscriptions. Mashrabiyas, with their complex latticework, were particularly characteristic of Egyptian architecture, providing privacy and ventilation. Leatherwork: tanners processed animal hides, and leatherworkers then transformed them into sandals, shoes, bags, bookbindings, and various other practical items. Egyptian leather was known for its durability and quality. Bookbinding and calligraphy: while writing was an intellectual pursuit, the creation of manuscripts was a highly skilled craft. Scribes copied texts, illustrators illuminated them with intricate miniatures and decorative borders, and skilled bookbinders created beautiful covers, often from leather, sometimes tooled with gold. Calligraphers were highly esteemed artists, transforming Arabic script into stunning visual art on paper, textiles, and architectural surfaces. The workshop environment was typically bustling and often located in the same building as the merchant's shop, or in specialized alleys within the souk. Apprentices would learn from masters, watching and assisting for years before gradually taking on more complex tasks. This hands-on, generational transmission of knowledge ensured the continuation of high-quality craftsmanship. The artisans not only contributed to the local economy but also played a significant role in Egypt's international trade. High-quality Egyptian crafts were exported across the Mediterranean, to the Levant, North Africa, and even further east, bringing wealth and prestige to the region. In essence, the crafts and workshops of medieval Egypt were dynamic spaces where creativity, skill, and dedication converged. They formed the backbone of the urban economy, produced goods that were both functional and beautiful, and left a lasting legacy of artistic and technical mastery that continues to inspire all. In medieval Egypt, religious life was not a separate sphere of existence but the very fabric of daily reality, permeating every aspect of society, from the highest echelons of power to the humblest peasant's hut. Islam, as the dominant religion, dictated the rhythm of the day, shaped social norms, inspired art, and provided a framework for justice and morality. The 5 daily prayers were the most fundamental aspect of religious observance. From dawn to nightfall, The muezzin's call to prayer echoed from the minarets, serving as a constant reminder of one's duty to God. Muslims would pause their work, perform ritual ablutions, and face the Kaaba in Mecca to perform their prayers, either individually or in congregation at a mosque. For many, the mosque was not just a place of worship but a community hub, a school and a place for social gathering. The Friday congregational prayer was particularly significant. Men were expected to attend the main mosque in their town or city, where a sermon would be delivered by an imam, often touching upon contemporary issues and reminding the community of their religious and moral obligations. This was a weekly occasion for communal solidarity and spiritual renewal. Beyond the daily prayers, the other pillars of Islam were equally important. Shahida, the fundamental belief in the oneness of God and the prophethood of Muhammad, was the cornerstone of identity. Zakat, a mandatory annual almsgiving to the poor and needy. This fostered a sense of social responsibility and redistribution of wealth, mitigating the harshest effects of poverty. The collection and distribution of zakat were often overseen by religious authorities or state officials. The month of Ramadan was a period of intense spiritual devotion. From dawn to dusk, Muslims abstained from food, drink, and other physical pleasures. Nights, however, were often filled with communal meals, special prayers, and social gatherings, creating a unique atmosphere of camaraderie and piety. Hajj for those who could afford it physically and financially. Performing the Hajj at least once in a lifetime was a deeply cherished ambition. Egyptian rulers often took great pride in organizing the annual Hajj caravan, providing protection and supplies for pilgrims from across North Africa and Egypt, making it a spectacular display of state power and religious devotion. Religious scholars, ulama, played a pivotal role in maintaining religious life. They were the interpreters of Islamic law, Sharia, judges, qadis, teachers, and spiritual guides. Their opinions were highly respected, and their presence ensured adherence to religious norms. Many ulama dedicated their lives to studying the Quran, Hadith, and Islamic jurisprudence, often teaching in madrasas or mosques. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, also had a profound influence on medieval Egyptian religious life. Sufi orders, tariqas, emerged, each with its own spiritual practices, rituals, like dhikr, the remembrance of God through chanting, and leadership. Sufi sheikhs, spiritual masters, attracted numerous followers, offering a path to deeper spiritual connection and personal enlightenment. Their zawiyas, Sufi lodges, were centers of communal life, study, and charity, often providing food and lodging for travelers and the poor. Festivals in honor of Sufi saints, Mawlid, were popular public celebrations. Holidays and festivals were joyous occasions that broke the routine of daily life. Eid al-Fitr marked the end of Ramadan, a time for feasting, gift-giving, visiting relatives, and communal prayers. Eid al-Adha commemorated Prophet Abraham's sacrifice, involving the ritual slaughter of an animal, sheep or goat, and sharing the meat with family, friends, and the poor. Mawlid al-Nabi, the celebration of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, a time for storytelling, poetry, and festive gatherings. Other local Mawlid festivals celebrated Sufi saints or important historical figures. Despite the dominance of Islam, the Coptic Christian community also maintained its distinct religious life. They had their own churches, clergy, and religious holidays, adhering to their ancient traditions. While they existed under Islamic rule, they were generally tolerated as dhimmis, protected people, paying a special tax in exchange for security and the right to practice their faith. Their churches and monasteries, particularly in Upper Egypt, continued to be centers of their spiritual and cultural life. In essence, religious life in medieval Egypt was a dynamic and multifaceted phenomenon. It provided comfort, structure, and meaning to the lives of its inhabitants, shaping their daily routines, social interactions, and understanding of the world. Faith was not just a belief but a lived experience, deeply embedded in the rhythm of the individual, the family, and the broader community. In the daily life of medieval Egypt, health and medicine were constant concerns, intricately linked to religious beliefs, traditional practices, and advanced scientific knowledge accumulated over centuries. While the understanding of disease was fundamentally different from modern concepts, Egyptian physicians and medical institutions were among the most advanced in the medieval world. The concept of health was often viewed holistically, encompassing not only the physical body but also the spiritual and emotional well-being. Illness was sometimes attributed to divine will, evil eye, or imbalance of bodily humors, influencing both diagnosis and treatment. However, Islamic emphasis on seeking knowledge and healing led to a strong tradition of scientific inquiry in medicine. Physicians and practitioners. Medieval Egyptian society had a diverse range of medical practitioners. At the pinnacle were the physicians, hakim or tabib, often highly educated men who studied in major medical centers like those in Cairo. Many were well versed in Greek, Roman, and Persian medical texts, integrating this knowledge with Islamic principles. They often specialized in various fields. Beneath them were a variety of other healers. Barbers often performed minor surgeries, bloodletting, and tooth extractions. Bone setters specialized in treating fractures and dislocations. Herbalists used extensive knowledge of local plants for medicinal purposes. Cupping therapists practiced hijama, applying cups to the skin to create suction for therapeutic effects. Midwives assisted women during childbirth and provided postnatal care. Religious healers recited Quranic verses or performed spiritual rites to cure ailments believed to have spiritual causes. Hospitals by Immerse. Medieval Egypt was home to some of the most sophisticated Immerse, or hospitals, in the Islamic world. These institutions were revolutionary for their time, offering not just treatment but also medical education and charitable care. Al-Mansuri Immerse in Cairo, founded by Sultan Qalawun in the late 13th century, was particularly renowned. It was a massive complex with separate wards for various illnesses, including internal medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, and even mental health. Services. Immerse provided free medical care to all, regardless of social status or religion. They employed a large staff of physicians, surgeons, pharmacists, nurses, and administrative personnel. Patients received food, clean clothing, and access to baths. Education. Hospitals often served as teaching institutions, where aspiring physicians learned through observation and practical experience under the guidance of senior doctors. Medical texts were studied, translated, and copied in hospital libraries. Pharmacies. Immerse had well-stocked pharmacies where compound medicines were prepared according to prescriptions. Pharmacists, Saidali, were skilled in herbal remedies and drug preparation. Medical treatments and practices. Medieval Egyptian medicine relied on a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical application. Herbal medicine, the vast majority of medications were plant-based. Physicians had extensive formularies of herbs, minerals, and animal products, often blended into complex compounds. Diet and nutrition. Diet played a crucial role in treatment, with specific foods prescribed or restricted based on the patient's condition and the humoral theory. Surgery. Surgeons performed procedures such as setting broken bones, treating wounds, performing amputations, and even rudimentary eye surgeries like cataract removal. Anesthesia was achieved using substances like opium, mandrake, or cannabis. Hygiene and sanitation. While the understanding of germ theory was absent, the importance of cleanliness was recognized, partly due to Islamic emphasis on ritual purity. Public baths, hammams, were widespread, and clean water was essential, though contaminated water sources remained a major cause of disease. Humoral theory. Medical understanding was largely based on the ancient Greek theory of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance of these humors, and treatments aimed to restore balance through diet, lifestyle changes, and specific remedies. Challenges to health. Despite advanced medical knowledge, the general population faced significant health challenges. Epidemics. Waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were common due to inadequate sanitation. Plague outbreaks, particularly the Black Death in the mid-14th century, devastated the population, sometimes wiping out a third or more of inhabitants. Child mortality. Infant and child mortality rates were extremely high due to infectious diseases, malnutrition, and limited knowledge of pediatric care. Malnutrition. While the Nile's fertility provided abundance, periods of poor floods or political instability could lead to food shortages and widespread malnutrition, making people more susceptible to disease. Injuries. Accidents in agriculture, crafts, or during conflicts were common, leading to injuries that could become infected and prove fatal without modern antibiotics. In daily life, people relied on a mix of professional medical care, traditional remedies, and spiritual practices. For the majority, especially in rural areas, access to a professional physician or bimeristan was limited, and they depended more on local healers and home remedies. Yet, the existence of sophisticated hospitals and a thriving intellectual tradition in medicine distinguished medieval Egypt as a significant center of healing and scientific inquiry in its era. In medieval Egypt, as in any complex society, the maintenance of law and order was paramount for stability, justice, and the smooth functioning of daily life. The legal system was deeply rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, drawing its authority from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. While the application of law could vary, the overarching aim was to ensure justice, protect rights, and punish transgressions according to divine decree. The primary legal framework was Sharia, or Islamic law. This comprehensive system governed not only criminal acts but also civil matters, personal status, commercial transactions, and even aspects of moral conduct. Sharia was derived from several sources. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, considered the literal word of God. Sunnah, the traditions and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, as recorded in Hadith. Ijma, the consensus of Muslim scholars on a particular legal issue. Qiyas, analogical reasoning used to derive rulings for new cases based on established principles. Judges, qadis, were the central figures in the legal system. A qadi was a highly respected religious scholar, learned in Islamic law. Their role was to interpret and apply Sharia in various disputes. They handled a wide range of cases, including civil disputes, contracts, debts, property disputes, and commercial disagreements, family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody, criminal cases, theft, assault, murder, and other offenses. Qadis held significant authority, and their rulings were binding. They were expected to be impartial, knowledgeable, and pious. Due to the volume of cases, there were often multiple qadis in larger cities, sometimes specializing in certain areas of law. For more serious criminal offenses, or those involving public order, the police force, shurta, played a crucial role. The shurta were responsible for maintaining peace, apprehending criminals, and enforcing laws. They patrolled the streets, especially at night, and were tasked with suppressing riots and disturbances. Their presence served as a deterrent to crime, and they often worked closely with the qadis in bringing offenders to justice. Another important figure was the mutasib. While often associated with the economy, the mutasib also played a role in maintaining public order and morality. Their duties included ensuring fair weights and measures in the markets, preventing fraud and dishonest practices in trade, monitoring public morality, such as ensuring proper prayer times were observed and preventing public consumption of alcohol, arbitrating minor disputes in the marketplace. The mutasib had the authority to impose immediate penalties for minor infractions. Punishments under Sharia varied depending on the nature of the crime. For certain offenses, fixed punishments, hudud, were prescribed in the Quran or Sunnah, such as flogging for unlawful sexual relations or consumption of alcohol, and amputation for theft. However, the conditions for applying hudud were very strict, requiring high standards of proof, which made their actual implementation relatively rare. For most other crimes, punishments were discretionary, ta'zir, allowing the qadi flexibility to determine the appropriate penalty, which could range from fines and imprisonment to flogging or public shaming, depending on the severity of the offense and the circumstances. The death penalty was reserved for the most heinous crimes, such as murder. Prisons existed, but they were often temporary holding facilities rather than long-term correctional institutions as understood today. Prisoners might be held until trial, until a debt was paid, or until a punishment was carried out. Conditions in prisons were often harsh. Justice for various social classes. While Sharia theoretically applied equally to all, in practice, the application of law could be influenced by social status, wealth, and connections. The ruling elite, particularly the Mamluk sultans and emirs, often operated with a degree of autonomy, sometimes bypassing qadi courts for matters involving their military or administrative personnel. They had their own military courts or handled disputes directly. However, the principle of justice for all was fundamental to Islamic ideals, and qadis often strove to uphold it, even challenging powerful individuals when necessary. For the common person, the qadi's court was the primary avenue for seeking justice or resolving disputes. People would bring their cases before the qadi, present witnesses, and make their arguments. While the process might seem slow by modern standards, it was an accessible system for most. In essence, law and order in medieval Egypt were upheld through a combination of religious law, a dedicated judiciary, an active police force, and a system of market and moral oversight. This framework aimed to ensure societal stability, protect individual rights within the Islamic legal tradition, and provide mechanisms for resolving conflicts and punishing wrongdoing in a complex and bustling society. Even in a world defined by hard work, religious observance, and daily struggles, entertainment and leisure played a crucial role in the lives of medieval Egyptians. These moments of respite provided a necessary escape from routine, fostered social bonds, and reflected the cultural richness and ingenuity of the era. The forms of entertainment varied widely, catering to different social classes, ages, and genders, from simple games to elaborate public spectacles. One of the most widespread and accessible forms of entertainment was storytelling, hikayat. Professional storytellers, known as hakawati, would gather crowds in public squares, coffee houses, which became popular in later medieval times, and private homes. They would narrate tales from ancient epics, folk legends, heroic sagas, and even the popular 1001 Nights. Their performances were vivid, engaging, and often accompanied by gestures and vocal mimicry. Listening to a hakawati was a popular pastime, offering both entertainment and moral lessons. Music and dance were integral to both private and public life. Various musical instruments were played, including the oud, a stringed lute-like instrument, the canon, a zither-like instrument, drums, like the darbuka, and flutes, nay. Musicians performed at celebrations, private gatherings, and even in some public spaces. Dance was also popular, ranging from folk dances to more refined performances at elite gatherings. Professional dancers, often women, would entertain at weddings and other festive occasions. Games and sports provided active forms of recreation. Chess, shatranj, was a highly esteemed intellectual game, played by scholars, merchants, and even rulers. It was seen as a test of strategy and intellect. Backgammon, nard, and other board games were also popular. Dice games were played, though sometimes viewed with suspicion due to their association with gambling. Physical sports included wrestling, fencing, and archery. Archery was particularly important due to its military relevance, and was practiced for both skill and recreation. Horse riding was a popular pastime for the elite, often involving races and displays of equestrian skill. Hunting was another aristocratic pursuit, combining sport with the practical acquisition of game. Public baths, hammams, beyond their hygienic function, served as important social spaces. Men and women would spend hours there, not only bathing but also socializing, exchanging news, and relaxing. They were places for gossip, networking, and simply unwinding from the stresses of daily life. Festivals and celebrations offered the most spectacular forms of entertainment, temporarily transforming the routine of daily life into periods of joyous revelry. Religious Eids, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, were marked by communal prayers, family visits, gift-giving, and festive meals. Streets would be decorated, and special treats prepared. Maulid al-Nabi, the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, involved public processions, illuminations, and recitations of poetry. Local Maulid festivals honoring Sufi saints were also widely celebrated with parades, music, dance, and markets. The flooding of the Nile was a major annual event, celebrated with festivities as it was crucial for the land's fertility. Public gatherings and sometimes boat parades took place. Coffee houses, especially in later centuries of the medieval period, emerged as vibrant centers of social life and entertainment in cities. Men would gather there to drink coffee, smoke pipes, play board games, listen to storytellers, and discuss news and politics. They were places of lively intellectual and social exchange. For children, entertainment was simpler but equally engaging. They played with rudimentary toys, engaged in street games like hide-and-seek or tag, and mimicked adult activities. Storytelling by elders was a common evening pastime. Public spectacles and parades were also popular. These could include military parades, processions for religious festivals, or the arrival of dignitaries. Acrobats, jugglers, and street performers would entertain crowds in open spaces. While formal leisure time might have been less abundant for the working classes, especially peasants, moments of rest and enjoyment were cherished. Evenings after a long day of labor, or the weekly Friday break, provided opportunities for family time, simple games, and social interaction within the community. In essence, entertainment and leisure in medieval Egypt were diverse and dynamic, reflecting the societal structure, religious values, and cultural creativity of the time. They provided essential outlets for joy, social connection, and spiritual enrichment, reminding us that even in a challenging era, the human spirit found ways to celebrate and unwind. In a world without paved roads, automobiles, or airplanes, transportation and travel in medieval Egypt were an integral part of daily life, trade, pilgrimage, and military campaigns. Although speeds were significantly slower than modern ones, the network of water and land routes was well developed, ensuring connections between cities, villages, and distant lands. River transport, the Nile, artery of life. Undoubtedly, the most important and common mode of transport was river transport on the Nile. The majestic river was a natural highway stretching for thousands of kilometers through the country. Felucca, these traditional sailing boats were primary for transporting people and goods. Thanks to their design, they could move upstream with the aid of wind, due to prevailing northerly winds, and downstream propelled by the river's current itself. Feluccas carried everything, from grain, livestock, and building materials to pottery, textiles, and handicrafts. They were also an everyday means of transport for peasants and city dwellers. Large barges, for transporting large volumes of cargo, such as grain after harvest. Larger, flat-bottomed barges were used, which could be towed by animals or moved by sails and the current. Small boats, small rowing boats were used for fishing, short crossings, or private use. River transport was cheap, efficient, and relatively safe compared to overland travel, which was prone to bandit attacks. It also allowed avoiding desert heat and the difficulties of moving through sand. Land transport, caravan routes. For journeys to regions the Nile did not reach, or for connections with neighboring countries, overland routes were used. Camels, these were the ships of the desert, indispensable for long journeys across the desert. Camels could carry large loads, withstand heat and lack of water, making them ideal for caravan trade that connected Egypt with Arabia, Syria, North Africa, and even distant regions of Africa. Donkeys. Donkeys were more common for short distances, transporting goods to markets, and as personal transport for peasants and less affluent city dwellers. They were hardy and inexpensive to maintain. Horses. Horses were primarily used for riding by the elite, emirs, soldiers, wealthy merchants, for fast messengers, or for military purposes. They were kept in stables and were significantly more expensive than donkeys or camels. Porters and carts. In cities and their surroundings, goods might be transported by porters, people carrying goods, or simple carts pulled by donkeys or oxen. Roads were unpaved, often uneven, making wheeled transport difficult outside urban centers. Travel and infrastructure. Travel was slow and potentially dangerous. The speed of travel by camel or donkey rarely exceeded a few kilometers per hour, and large caravans moved even slower. Caravanserais, for travelers in caravans, especially over long distances. There was a network of caravanserais, khans or funduks. These were fortified inns that provided safe lodging for merchants, their animals, and their goods. They included stables, warehouses, living quarters, and often a mosque and a communal bath. They were vital for supporting trade and travel. Water stations. In desert regions, there were also water stations or wells that were guarded and maintained to supply caravans with water. Security. Traveling caravans were often accompanied by armed guards to protect against bandits who might attack in the desert or on remote routes. Purposes of travel were diverse. Trade. Merchants traveled to buy and sell goods, making deals in distant markets. Pilgrimage. Hajj, the annual journey to Mecca, was a huge logistical operation, gathering thousands of pilgrims from all over Egypt and North Africa. The Egyptian Sultan ensured the organization and protection of this large caravan. Military campaigns. Armies moved by land or the Nile for military operations, which required immense logistical effort. Administrative travel. Officials and envoys traveled between administrative centers. Personal visits and migration. People visited relatives, moved in search of work or better conditions. Despite the difficulties and dangers, the network of transport and travel was well established and functioned effectively. It allowed Egypt to remain a central hub in global trade and ensure internal exchange of goods and ideas. Every boat on the Nile and every caravan in the desert was living proof of the connections that united the medieval Egyptian world. Medieval Egypt, like any developed civilization, was primarily an urban civilization. While the majority of the population lived in rural areas, cities were the centers of power, trade, crafts, education, and culture. They were dynamic, crowded, bustling places that vividly reflected the way of life and values of society. The architecture of these cities did not just provide shelter. It was a functional response to the climate, an expression of religious beliefs, and an indicator of social status. Cairo was undoubtedly the largest and most important city in medieval Egypt. Founded by the Fatimids as Al-Qahira, it quickly became one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, a rival to Baghdad and Damascus. Other important cities included Alexandria, Fustat, Aswan, and other cities along the Nile. The structure of cities was quite organic, developing around central axes. Mosque. The Grand Mosque was the heart of the city, around which other important buildings were often clustered. It was not only a place of prayer but also a center for education, justice, and public gatherings. Bazaar. Trading rows were located next to the mosque or in its vicinity. It was a labyrinth of narrow streets, each specializing in certain goods or crafts. Caravanserais. Next to the bazaars were khans, large fortified buildings with inner courtyards where merchants could store their goods and house themselves and their animals. Hammams. Public baths were common in all cities, providing opportunities for hygiene and social interaction. Residential quarters. Cities consisted of many quarters, often organized along ethnic or religious lines. Each quarter had its own mosque, fountain, bakery, and small shops. The streets of medieval Egyptian cities were narrow, winding, and often irregular. This was not accidental. Such streets created shade, protecting from the scorching sun, and made it difficult for enemy troops to advance in case of a siege. Most streets were unpaved, making them dusty in dry weather and muddy after rain. Traffic was intense. People, donkeys, camels, small carts, all created a constant din and bustle. Building materials depended on availability and wealth. Clay and mud brick, these were the main materials for most houses, especially in rural areas and poorer urban quarters. Thick clay walls provided good insulation against the heat. Fired brick and stone, in larger cities, especially for building mosques, palaces, madrasas, and homes of the wealthy, fired brick and quality stone were used. This provided greater strength and durability. Timber was a valuable resource used for beams, doors, window frames, and for creating exquisite decorative elements. Types of buildings: residential houses. Privacy. The most important feature of residential houses was privacy. Most houses had an inner courtyard that was the center of family life. All rooms opened onto the courtyard, not the street. This provided ventilation, light, and seclusion from street noise and dust. Mashrabiyah, characteristic openwork wooden screens covering windows facing the street. They allowed residents to observe the outside world while remaining unseen by outsiders, and also provided air circulation. Height. In cities, houses were often multi-story due to limited land. Lower floors could be used as shops or workshops, and upper floors as living quarters. Makad. This was an open balcony or loggia on the upper floor, facing the courtyard, where the family could spend time in the cool evening. Mosques were architectural masterpieces and symbols of Islamic presence. They ranged from simple prayer rooms to majestic complexes. Minarets, tall towers from which the muezzin called to prayer, were a hallmark of cities. Inner courtyard, a large open courtyard, often with a fountain for ablutions, surrounded by colonnades. Prayer hall, a large hall with numerous columns supporting the roof. The mihrab and minbar were essential elements. Domes, often used to cover prayer halls or separate parts of the mosque. Madrasas, educational institutions, often combined with mosques. They had lecture halls, libraries, and student rooms. Madrasa architecture often included large inner courtyards and iwans. Bimaristans, hospitals were impressive structures reflecting the development of medical science. They had separate wards, fountains, courtyards for patients to walk, pharmacies, and libraries. Fortifications. Large cities, especially Cairo, had strong walls and gates to protect against enemies. The famous Cairo gates, such as Bab Zuwayla and Bab al-Futu, were not only defensive structures but also architectural monuments. Water supply and sanitation in cities were a challenge. Although aqueducts and sables existed, sewage systems were primitive. Waste was often collected in cesspits or discarded in the streets, creating unsanitary conditions and contributing to the spread of diseases, despite personal hygiene maintained through hammams. The architecture of medieval Egypt was deeply integrated into daily life. It was not just a collection of buildings, but an expression of an entire worldview that combined practical needs, aesthetic ideals, and religious values. It created a unique urban landscape that still inspires admiration for its beauty and functionality, telling stories about the past and the lives of those who inhabited these streets and homes. Medieval Egypt was a complex and centralized state, and its functioning largely depended on the effectiveness of its government and administrative system. Over centuries, Egypt was ruled by various dynasties, the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, and then the Mamluks, each bringing its own characteristics to the administrative structure, but the fundamental operations remained recognizable. The government was comprehensive, encompassing everything from tax collection to warfare and maintaining order. At the head of the state stood the ruler, the caliph under the Fatimids, the sultan under the Ayyubids and Mamluks, or the emir. This was an absolute authority, combining secular and often religious functions. The ruler was the supreme judge, commander-in-chief of the army, and guardian of Islamic law. His court in Cairo was the center of political life, where important decisions were made, state ceremonies performed, and intrigues unfolded. The ruler's power was supported by both military force and legitimacy derived from religious authority and the support of the ulama. The vizier was the ruler's right hand, a kind of prime minister, who managed the daily affairs of the state. The vizier coordinated the activities of various departments, controlled finances, appointed officials, and executed the sultan's will. The position of vizier was extremely influential, yet also dangerous, as he often became a target for intrigues and palace coups. The administrative system was extensive and consisted of numerous departments, each responsible for a specific area. Diwan al-Kharaj. This was one of the most important departments, responsible for tax collection. The main source of income was land taxes from agricultural lands, which were based on the productivity of the lands, dependent on the Nile's floods. Taxes on trade, customs duties, and jizya were also collected. Diwan al-Jund, responsible for maintaining the army, its equipment, paying soldiers' wages, and conducting military campaigns. The army in medieval Egypt was a key instrument of power and control. Diwan al-Barid, responsible for postal communication between different parts of the empire, as well as for collecting intelligence information and monitoring the loyalty of local rulers. Diwan al-Insha dealt with the ruler's official correspondence, drafting decrees, treaties, and other state documents. Diwan al-Mazalim was a kind of court of justice, where the ruler or vizier personally heard citizens' complaints about injustice or abuse of power by officials. This gave citizens an opportunity to obtain justice if they could not find it in regular courts. Local administration was carried out through a network of governors, who were appointed by the ruler to manage the provinces. Governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and executing the central government's decrees in their territory. Under them worked local officials and administrators. Qadis, as mentioned earlier, were an integral part of the administrative system, applying Sharia. They were independent of secular authority in their decisions, which theoretically ensured a degree of justice. Their role was key to maintaining social harmony and the legitimacy of the rule. The army played a decisive role in maintaining power and control. During the Mamluk Sultanate, which lasted from 1250 to 1517, the army was formed from slave soldiers, who after manumission and training became professional soldiers and officers. This system, though unique, ensured high combat effectiveness and loyalty of the army, as the Mamluks were entirely dependent on the Sultan. They played a key role in protecting Egypt from external threats, such as the Crusaders and the Mongols. The state's sources of income were primarily agrarian. Egypt's wealth was based on the fertility of the Nile, which provided abundant harvests of grains, allowing the state to collect significant taxes. Trade was also an important source of income, as Egypt was at the crossroads of important trade routes between East and West, and between Africa and Europe. Customs duties and trade taxes, especially on the import and export of spices and luxuries, brought significant funds to the state treasury. Challenges of governance were numerous. Corruption, local rebellions, court intrigues, external threats, all constantly tested the state apparatus. However, despite these challenges, the government of medieval Egypt, especially during the time of strong sultans, was quite effective in maintaining order, defending borders, and ensuring the functioning of the economy, which allowed Egypt to remain one of the most powerful and prosperous states in the region for centuries. This administrative legacy, though transformed, laid the foundations for many of the country's modern institutions. Medieval Egypt was a melting pot of cultures, which left a deep mark on its art and cultural life. As a crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe, an heir to ancient Egyptian, Greco-Roman, Byzantine, and primarily Islamic civilizations, Egypt developed a unique artistic style that combined various influences but always retained its own distinct identity. Religion, especially Islam, played a dominant role in shaping art, determining its forms, themes, and permissible depictions. Islamic art focused on the beauty of abstraction, calligraphy, geometric patterns, and arabesques. The prohibition on depicting living beings in a religious context stimulated the development of complex and refined decorative forms. Architecture was arguably the most impressive form of art. Mosques, madrasas, bimaristan's, palaces, public fountains, and caravanserais were not only functional buildings but also works of art. The mosques of Cairo, such as the Mosque of Ibn Tuluan, Al-Azhar Mosque, and the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, are outstanding examples of medieval Islamic architecture. They were characterized by vast inner courtyards, arcades, elegant minarets, intricate domes, and rich decoration. Walls and domes were adorned with stone and stucco carving, complex geometric patterns, floral arabesques, and of course, calligraphy. Calligraphy was the highest form of art in the Islamic world. It transformed the writing of Arabic script into a refined artistic practice. Calligraphers were highly respected masters who created masterpieces on mosque walls, in Quranic manuscripts, on ceramics, metalwork, and textiles. Different styles of calligraphy had their own characteristics and applications. Calligraphy was used not only for Quranic verses but also for poetry, proverbs, and rulers' names. Applied arts flourished. Ceramics and glass. Egyptian potters produced a wide range of ceramic products, from everyday utensils to exquisite glazed tiles that adorned mosques and palaces. Glassblowers created elegant glass lamps for mosques, perfume bottles, and other vessels, often decorated with colored enamels or gold. Metalwork. Metal craftsmen produced copper and bronze items, cauldrons, trays, ewers, and lamps. They often decorated them with engraving, silver or gold inlay, and intricate patterns. Jewelers created delicate gold and silver ornaments. Textiles, Egyptian fabrics, especially linen, were known throughout the Mediterranean. Artisans created embroidered textiles, luxurious carpets, and tapestries, using silk, cotton, and wool. Wood carving. Since wood was a valuable material, it was used to create exquisite furniture, doors, minbars in mosques, and mashrabiyas, open-work wooden screens that were not only functional but also true works of art. Bookmaking and illumination were an important branch of art. Scribes copied the Quran, scientific treatises, and poetic collections. Many manuscripts were richly illuminated and calligraphically written. These were valuable items reflecting a high level of craftsmanship. Music was an integral part of cultural life. Although musical notation was rare, oral traditions conveyed knowledge of melodies and rhythms. Instruments such as the oud, ney, canon, and daf were used. Music accompanied celebrations, ceremonies, weddings, and was an important part of entertainment. Literature and poetry flourished. Arabic was the language of science, religion, and literature. Egyptian scholars and poets made significant contributions to the development of Arabic literature, creating works on history, geography, philosophy, medicine, and of course, poetry. 1001 Nights, while not a purely Egyptian work, has deep roots in Arab and Egyptian storytelling tradition. Oral tradition was no less important than written tradition. Hakawati storytellers were carriers of stories, legends, and epics that they passed down from generation to generation. This sustained the vitality of folk culture. The influence of Coptic culture was also noticeable. Although Islam dominated, the Coptic community maintained its own artistic traditions, especially in church architecture, icon painting, textiles, and Coptic calligraphy. Some elements of ancient Egyptian and Coptic art could influence Islamic art, especially in its early stages. Overall, the art and culture of medieval Egypt were a vivid reflection of its rich history, religious values, and the ability to assimilate and transform diverse influences. This was a period when Egypt was one of the main centers of the Islamic world, and its art and cultural achievements left an indelible mark on human history. They continue to amaze with their beauty, complexity, and deep symbolism today. Medieval Egypt was a society that, despite its internal dynamics, clearly adhered to a hierarchical structure. Each individual occupied a specific place, determined by their origin, religion, wealth, profession, and connections. Although this structure was not absolutely static, and some social mobility was possible, the lives of most people unfolded within their social stratum, with its own rules, privileges, and limitations. At the very top of this hierarchy was the ruling elite. This was the Sultan and his family, who held absolute political, military, and economic power. Their lives were full of luxury, ceremonies, and intrigues. The Sultan resided in magnificent palaces, surrounded by numerous servants, advisors, and guards. His clothes were the most expensive, his food the most exquisite, and his decrees were law for millions. However, this power was not entirely secure. Palace coups, conspiracies, and external threats were a constant part of their lives. Below the ruler was the military aristocracy, which during the Mamluk Sultanate consisted mainly of the Mamluks themselves. This was a unique military caste, formed from slave soldiers who were bought as children, raised in special barracks and trained in military arts, ethics, and even art. After their training, they were freed and became emirs, generals, and high-ranking officials. Mamluks held the most important positions in the state, owned large estates, and received significant incomes. Their lives centered on military affairs, hunting, horse racing, and maintaining their status. They were the Sultan's support, but also the main threat to his rule, often overthrowing weak or unpopular leaders. Their clothing was luxurious, their weapons exquisite, and their lifestyle a demonstration of power and wealth. Slightly lower, but still at the top of society, were the high officials and administrators, viziers, qadis, heads of diwans, and other functionaries. These individuals were predominantly educated, often from wealthy urban families or from among the Mamluks. They managed the daily affairs of the state, collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained order. Their incomes and influence were substantial, and they lived in spacious houses, surrounded by servants. An important and highly respected stratum were the ulama, religious scholars, imams, madrasa teachers, muftis, and qadis. They were the guardians of Islamic knowledge, laws, and morality. Their authority stemmed not from wealth or military power, but from their knowledge and piety. Ulama often acted as advisors to rulers, interpreted Sharia, and educated the younger generation. Although their income was not always significant, their social weight and the respect they received from all segments of society were immense. They were the intellectual elite of the country. Merchants and traders constituted the middle and upper middle class, especially in cities. Large merchants who organized international caravans and sea voyages could accumulate vast wealth. They were the engine of the economy, bringing exotic goods and exporting local ones. Their lives involved risk, but also great opportunities. Smaller traders in the bazaars were also an important part of this stratum. Many of them were members of guilds that protected their interests. Their living standards were comfortable, though without the excesses of the elite. Artisans and urban laborers formed a significant part of the urban population. These included master potters, weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters, leatherworkers, builders, and others. They were organized into guilds that provided some stability, quality control, and mutual aid. Their lives involved hard but skilled labor. They lived in small but neat houses. Their diet was simpler than that of merchants, but more stable than that of peasants. The largest and least privileged stratum were the peasants. They constituted the vast majority of the population and were the backbone of the country's economy. Their lives were inextricably linked to the land and the Nile. They cultivated fields, grew grain, vegetables, and fruits, paid high taxes, and performed services for the state or landowners. Their living conditions were very modest: simple mud brick houses, minimal furniture, a diet based on bread and legumes. Their lives were hard and depended on the whims of nature and the Nile's productivity. A separate category consisted of non-Muslims, predominantly Coptic Christians and a small Jewish community. They lived under the status of protected peoples, which meant they had the right to practice their religion, preserve their traditions and culture. However, they were subject to a special tax, had restrictions on building new religious structures, and some other limitations in public life. Despite this, many Copts were skilled artisans, merchants, and also held important positions in the administration, especially in tax and financial matters, as they were well educated. Their coexistence with Muslims was mostly peaceful, though periods of tension occasionally occurred. At the lowest rung of the social ladder were slaves. Slavery existed in medieval Egypt, as in many other societies of that time. Slaves were of various origins: prisoners of war, those bought in markets. There were military slaves who later gained freedom and status, domestic slaves who performed household chores, and slaves who worked in fields or workshops. Although Islamic law regulated the treatment of slaves, urging humanity, their lives depended on the whims of their masters. However, Islam also encouraged the manumission of slaves, and many of them, especially domestic slaves, could gain freedom after service or by will. Some slaves could even rise socially. Overall, the social structure of medieval Egypt was complex but functional. It ensured stability and order, despite internal contradictions. Each stratum had its role and its contribution to the functioning of society, creating a multifaceted and eventful daily world. In any society, daily life is inextricably linked to customs and etiquette, unwritten rules that regulate behavior, communication, and interaction between people. Medieval Egypt, with its multifaceted culture based on Islamic principles and local traditions, had a complex system of these norms, which determined everything from greetings to rules of hospitality and public behavior. Adherence to etiquette was not merely a display of politeness, but also a reflection of respect, status, and moral values. Greetings and communication. It all began with a greeting. The most common greeting was Assalamu alaikum, to which one replied, Wa alaikum assalam. This was not just a formal greeting, but a wish for blessings and safety. Visual contact and facial expression were also important. A welcoming smile and a respectful gaze were valued. Handshaking was common among men. Depending on status and closeness, a handshake could be accompanied by kissing the hand or placing the hand on the heart. Between men and women, unless they were close relatives, direct physical contact in public places was rare. Conversation was conducted calmly, with respect for the interlocutor. Interrupting was unacceptable. Direct criticism or arguments in public were avoided, preferring to resolve disagreements more discreetly or privately. Hospitality. Hospitality was one of the highest virtues in medieval Egyptian society, deeply rooted in Islamic tradition and Bedouin customs. Receiving a guest, especially a traveler, was considered a sacred duty. Invitation. An invitation to one's home was a great honor. Refusing without a valid reason was impolite. Reception. Guests were greeted at the entrance, invited to remove their shoes before entering living areas. They were offered the best seats, water, and then food and drinks. Food was a central element of hospitality. The host strived to offer the guests the best they had. Guests typically ate with their right hand, from large communal dishes. It was important to taste everything served to show respect for the host's efforts. Duration of stay. A guest could stay for up to 3 days, and the host was obliged to feed and care for them. After this period, the guest could stay, but was then considered part of the household and expected to help with chores or pay. Farewell. Upon leaving, the guest expressed gratitude, and the host expressed wishes for a good journey. Behavior in public places. Mosques. Entry to the mosque required removing shoes and wearing clean clothes. Inside, one should behave quietly, with respect, avoid secular conversations, and not cross the path of those praying. Bazaars. Although bazaars were noisy, certain norms were still observed. Bargaining was acceptable and expected, but excessive pressure or aggressive behavior was considered impolite. Privacy. The privacy of others was respected. It was unacceptable to peer into other people's homes or listen to conversations. Clothing. Public attire should be modest. For men, this meant covering the body from the navel to the knees. For women, covering the entire body except the face and hands. Table manners. Right hand. One should eat and take food only with the right hand, as the left was considered unclean. Beginning of meal. The meal began with Bismillah. Communal dishes. Food was often served on large communal trays. Everyone took food from the part of the dish directly in front of them, without reaching across the entire platter. Satiety. One should not completely empty the plate, or eat every last crumb, so as not to appear greedy or overly hungry. However, leaving too much was also impolite. Completion. After finishing the meal, one said Alhamdulillah. Respect for elders. Respect for elders, parents, community elders, teachers, was fundamental. Children and youth should behave humbly before elders, listen to their advice, and not interrupt. This was expressed in both speech and gestures. Behavior and relations between men and women. Islamic norms provided for a certain segregation of sexes in public spaces. Women spent most of their time at home, and if they went out, they had to be modestly dressed and sometimes cover their faces. Public contacts between unmarried men and women were minimal. However, within the family circle and among close relatives, interaction was free and warm. Adherence to these customs and etiquette was vital for the harmonious functioning of society. They shaped daily interaction, strengthened social ties, and reflected deeply ingrained religious and cultural values that defined the lives of every Egyptian in the Middle Ages.